social media after this if anybody would like to view this afterwards. So our today's presentation is Ernest Saint Germain. He is Lac de Flambeau Ojibwe. By tribal tradition, he was named Minodei by his grandmother. Later, he was given the name Beneshi, the name of his Meday mentor and teacher. His name thus became Minodei Beneshi. His name means lifts your heart bird. He is from the Ajajak Dudum, the Crane clan of the Ojibwe, and is by tradition an orator, speaker, and teacher. Educated in public schools and universities, including the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire undergraduate degree, University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point master's degree, and the University of Nevada, Reno National Judicial College, Judicial Law, Judge St. Germain claims that his most important teachings have come from those elders who instilled in him his Anishinaabe identity. He firmly believes that nothing he knows belongs to him, but rather was given to him by his mentors and teachers, as well as from directions and instructions that came to him through dreams. By that tradition, he freely gives teachings, stories, and knowledge to others when they ask for it. Judge Saint Germain was appointed to the Lac de Flambeau Tribal Court in 1990 and served as served the tribe as chief judge for 12 years. He also served as chief trial judge for the Coteray tribe for 5 years. Today he is retired but continues to serve on the faculty at the National Judicial College and at the University of Nevada, Reno. Judge St. Germain also hears cases and appeals for tribal courts in Wisconsin, but has mostly been focusing his energy as a peacekeeper. He works with families and especially tribal youth. He has also served as a curriculum coordinator and a writer for tribal programs and schools in Wisconsin, and is also the author of Winnebuju Adizoken, a collection of traditional Ojibwe stories. Most recently, he worked with his daughter and wife to develop and write a semeke, a collection of spiritual offerings for the Family Circles program in Lac de Flambeau. So without further ado, it is my honor to introduce my father, Ernie St. Germain.
Miigwech, big one. Is that going to be close enough? Everybody hear me? Should I hold it closer? I know sometimes I don't speak loud enough. Is that okay there? Maybe give me
I can't hear you.
I can hear, but it's faint.
Are we good? I'll just hold it right here. Well, Buju Shinabe, say my favorite time of the year when it's really cold outside, and what I'm noticing about today and the last several days is that the sun is starting to come up earlier, and it's starting to go down later. You could see it earlier and earlier every day, and that tells me that life is returning to Aki, and always new life coming. And so that's a really good time of the year for me. I like to ski, and I like a lot of snow. This really is my favorite time of the year. And maybe some of you heard me say or write that on these cold days like this, even colder than this, is when you should go out early before sunrise and take in that deep breath through your nose. And the old timers taught us that it's that breath that turns you back and turns you back toward life and refreshes you and empowers you and gives you hope for the future. And so think about that on the coldest night in the morning before sunrise. Go out there and take that breath, and guarantee you when you go back inside, you'll feel a lot better. So I'm taking this discussion today on a more traditional approach. And we're going to be talking about treaties from the way the old timers viewed it and uh, what it meant to them. And if you go way, way back, they, when they talk about treaties and what they are, they would say Odawa ge. And my nephew here, Odawa, is right here with us, and he works here at the college. And it has a lot to do with his name. Odawa ge has to do with bartering or selling or trading. And old timers didn't view that that act as you go into a store and you put money down and you get something back because it has a price on it. It was viewed more of negotiating for something and reaching consensus on it. And when the two of you have reached consensus, then you agree to that deal. And of course, the humor when you went away from that is you would laugh and chuckle and say, well, I got the best of him. And I think of my grandma and grandpa and my great grandma who planted rice in a lake up northeast of here. And there was a farmer that owned that land. And of course, they asked him if they could do that. And then they wanted to make their camp right down on the lake. And he let them do that. And he had a trail back there to the lake because he liked to fish. And so they went down there and they made their camp. And they stayed there 2 weeks. And they planted the rice. And the next season, my Kubade, she kept going back. She was a boss of the rice, boss of the lake. She kept going back a couple seasons and it was coming up. And she decided every season how they would harvest and whether they would harvest, whether they would knock the rice back into the lake, whether they would take some, whether they would tie it up, and how they would harvest. And so they kept doing that. And finally, one season, they finally had just a huge, huge harvest. And I remember as a little boy, the rice pits that Grandpa had made with poles coming down from the tree. And there's a pit right below us and lined with buckskin. They would put the dried rice in there and we danced it. And Grandpa would sing these ricing songs for us. And we'd be dancing that rice, loosening the husks on it. And I remember those old songs. I could probably sing several of them for you, but I'm getting off track. But after we were done with that whole processing, that season, we had 4 of those 100-pound gunny sacks of finished rice, cleaned rice. And they had it in the back of the truck and the vehicles that went back there. And we took that back up and we had to go by the farmer's house. And we stopped there and Grandpa went back and together 2 of them took one of those bags up to the farmer's house and they put it on the porch and the farmer came out and said, "What's this?" And they said, "It's our share of the rice for you letting us come here and do this every season." And the farmer was just dumbstruck. And he said, "Well, gee, I've got something for you because you planted that rice out there and I love the fish. And I think I like duck dinner more than the fish. And since you had that rice out there, oh man, plentiful ducks. And I've been enjoying meals of duck in the fall. And so I'm really appreciating that. And I have something for you." And he went back behind, and he pulled a whole cart back, a big cart with those big wagon wheels, and hooked it up to the back of the truck, and that was plumb full of potatoes. He said, I had a really good harvest this year, and I want to share this with you. And Grandpa and Grandma, and everybody was just in shock. All of those potatoes. And they could just imagine how many Ritz cellars around Reserve and Round Lake and New Post and Signer and Whitefish, they were going to fill up with all of those potatoes. They were really going to share them. And of course, you'd have potatoes the whole winter. And they both shook hands, good trade. And when we went away, Grandpa was laughing going down the road. He said, we sure got the best of him. He thought he had more potatoes and he gave him rice. But that farmer, his daughter was a teacher in Hayward, grade school teacher, and got to know my mom, and they were telling that story. And she says her dad was laughing because he thought he got the best of Grandpa with all that rice. Well, that's the wonderful thing about that trading, and that's what I'm talking about, is what treaties was an agreement and a consensus, and both sides are happy that it was a good trade. So what you're doing is trading for something, and one side wants something, and they trade something for it. And that's really, in reality, what treaties are. And so they would say, Odawage, it's like he sells or he trades or he barters something. And the Anishinaabe, the Udawa, that was their whole existence. That was their responsibility to the Anishinaabe nation. So there were different ways, of course, to trade. And I have an example down here, the really fun way to do it, the moccasin game. And you can see it's laid out here. I have a rug, and I have, instead of moccasins, when I do this with little kids, I have skins. And you just use 4 skins. And you can have 2 people, or you can have teams. You can have families on a family on that side, a family on this side. But there's one loader who hides an object, and you have the other side is the shooter who guesses. And once the game begins, there's only one rule, and there's no talking. So you have to use sign language. And the way you can talk is by singing those old game songs, and there were many of them. And of course, some of them were pretty humorous, and the idea was to get you laughing and distract you. But this was one way that trading and that selling and that bartering, something that I want that you have, and something that I have that you want, and instead of just arguing about it, have a game. Whoever wins gets what we wagered, and that's all about that negotiating and reaching consensus and reaching it in a good way. And so by using games, you avoided conflict, and the loser just accepted that that's the game of chance. That's the way it works. Another game is the dish game, and that one uses dice, and you can see the dice there, and 2 of them have holes in them, And of course, the dice have two sides. One is dark side, and the other is light. And that I always tell kids that Winnebuju taught me this game. And Winnebuju taught me the magic in this game. And so when I play, you probably don't want to play with me because I know the magic that went into this. And other people can play it fine, but remember, if you play it with me, Winnebuju gave me the magic, and I put that on these dice. And so Monday, when I was at the school, I asked the second and third graders, do you know what that magic is? How I got that on there? Oh, they were all guessing back. They couldn't figure out paint, they were saying, and color crayon. And I said, no, it's magic marker. And none of them laughed, and pretty soon one was giggling, and I get it. Anyway, the idea is you toss them in the air, and you got to catch them. And like I told you, I've got magic. And if they ever land all one color, you won the whole bet, you won the whole game. So all of you just lost, and you all owe me $10 for learning this game. So you can mail that in to me, or the next time you see me, you can give it to me. Anyway, I told you I have magic. Honest, that happens every time I do it. So when I think back to when I was young, growing up I grew up here at La Coudray. My mother's from this reservation, and my grandma and my grandma lived right next door here. So this pine trees right next to the college here was a playground. And so fond memories right around this area. And those old timers were wonderful storytellers, and they always taught lessons with their stories and gave guidance with them. And this, of course, was a favorite time of year of telling those stories. And one of the main topics of treaties for we Ojibwe people are our fish. Gigowug are fish, and Wabashkeshiwug are deer. Also, medicines and foods that we gather, those were issues. But one time I had those old timers together. Oh, it was Pipe Mustache and Beneshi Baker, and from Flambeau, one of the greatest storytellers I think I've ever known in my life. His name was Beishagizik. Some of you know him as Bob Link. Oh, what a wonderful storyteller. And they got to talking about who had the biggest fish, whoever caught the biggest fish. And Beneshi talked, he says, well, one time I was hungry for oka, and I decided to go up to Chief Lake from my wigwam there on 6 Mile. So I walked all the way up the road, all the way up the hill and to the corner, and then I went down that road all the way down and around the corner and all the way down to the end to old Bill Conger's place. And I told him what I was doing, and we visited for a while. I went down the lake, then I went all the way across out there over to my fish shack. And I got in there and I had my decoy and I was working it. And all of a sudden, over on this side of that hole that I had, here come a big nose. and it was moving really slow, coming and looking at my decoy. All I could see was this nose, and it was as big as the hole. That's how big that fish was. And I looked at that nose coming in real slow. I looked at my spear. Oh, man, I didn't have my musky spear. I had my walleye spear. My musky spear was back at the house in the shed. So very quietly, I set down my walleye spear and I snuck out the door and I went running across the ice, all the way across to the shore, up the hill, all the way to Bill Conger's. And he stuck his head out the door as I was running. Didn't even have time to say what I was doing. Ran down the road, round the corner, up the hill, down the corner, down the hill, all the way back to 6 Mile. Got back to my wigwam, ran back to the shed, opened the door, and I had to dig through stuff and shovels and rakes and junk. And there I finally found my musky spear. Pulled it out, took off running, back down across my yard, down the road, all the way up the hill, turn left, down the road, down around the corner, past Bill's house, and all I had time to do was show him my spear. Ran down the hill all the way across the ice, opened the door, and looked in, and the tail was just going out. That's how big the fish are here in LCO. And without even cracking a smile or laughing or nothing, Bob Link said, one time I was fishing on Flambeau Lake, and it was just getting to be about sundown. And I was looking across the lake over there, and I was fishing, and I see over here on the side a big buck. Oh, he had a great big rack like this. And he come down over on the edge to get a drink of water. And he's over there drinking. And all of a sudden, he looked across over by that big island, Strawberry Island. And he must have saw an old girlfriend over there because he decided to swim across and go spoon with her for a while. So in the water he went and he started swimming. And he's going and, oh, he was big. He was just making a nice wake, how fast he was going. And all of a sudden, over here, I see a big swirl. And then that swirl started moving toward him. And it went right at him like this, and it hit him. And he just shook like that in the water. All of a sudden, now he's swimming faster. And he's going along pretty good. Now that wake is bigger. All of a sudden, the swirl comes back again over there like this, and now it's really coming. This time it hit him really hard, and he even went under the water, and he came back up again. Now he was really going, making a huge wake. It's over here that just a big, huge splash. That swirl was so big, it came and hit him again, took him down. Antlers disappeared. He was gone. Now he popped up over here, and he's going really fast over that way. And you know that big rock over there? They call it Medicine Rock. Boy, he smacked up against that rock and went under again. You know, that's how big the muskies are in Flambeau. He decided to swallow that buck, but the antlers were too big, because that's how big the deer in Flambeau are too. Antlers were too big, so he knocked them off on that rock over there. Then he swallowed them. That's how big the muskies are. And then I finally laughed. So those old stories build upon our love for our traditions and our connections to the environment and to the waters and to the fish and to the deer. And they teach us how important those things are to us and how sacred they become because they're part of our who we are, part of our identity. So when the time comes and when the treaties were entered into back in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, and I'm talking 1800s now, one of the things those old timers did back then, and they didn't understand English, so they had translators and interpreters. And at the Treaty of Prairie du Chien, all the delegation came and they had the papers all laid out on the table, and all the headmen were supposed to sign on that side, and the delegation from DC was going to sign on this side. Before those old headmen would sign that document, they wanted it translated. They wanted every word interpreted. And after 2 weeks, the delegation from DC was enraged because they wanted to understand every word. And one of the things they wanted to make sure of was that they preserved those hunting and fishing and gathering rights that were so important to us, important to our identity. And so those were put into those treaties. Those rights were always reserved. Going back to hundreds of years ago now, the state of Wisconsin ignored those treaties and started imposing laws that restricted our hunting and fishing rights illegally, ignoring the treaties, and they took those rights away. So when I was a young man, in my teens, we could only spear on the reservation. We couldn't spear off the reservation. And of course, most of you know the story of Fred and Mike Treble, and there's a painting of the two of them standing right there, who decided to challenge that. And that led to the Voigt case. In the early 1980s, 83, the courts ruled in our favor and upheld the treaties that we had the right to hunt and fish and gather in the ceded territory, which was clearly defined in those treaties. And that led to protests and violence on the to hunters. And I mean, believe me, my brother Vince over in Flambeau and my brother Terry, they were amazing hunters. And I was riding with them, and a van stopped us, and a guy jumped out and jumped in front of us and come around to the side and called us the filthiest, dirtiest, rotten names you could ever imagine. Why don't you effing Indians leave my deer alone? And I just had to chuckle because we're winning this fight. You're losing, and that's why you're angry. Your anger is yours, it's not mine. You know, I know who I am. Ojibwe and Anishinaabe and Dao. That was given to me by those old timers. But before the courts and the treaty cases, back when I was a teen, there was a favorite place to go spear, and that was up at Riverside. And for those of you who don't know where Riverside is, if you take Highway B from here and go east, over by the East Fork, there's a community, an old Anishinaabe community called Riverside. And the reservation came up right there. And it was right along the river, and there was quite a community there. And in the wintertime, when they lower the water out of the flowage at the dam, that would go back to like it was in the old days, the river. And in the spring, when that ice was gone, there's all those rocks down there. And let me tell you, those ogawag, those walleye, oh, they loved that. And they would come up, and I tell you, you could just go there, and there's so many of them, you could just basically pick them up and put them in a gunny sack. And of course, the wardens loved to hide up the road and wait for us to put those walleye in our car and drive up to the stop sign to Highway B, because that was off the reservation. And as soon as you drove off the reservation with a deer or fish or anything else, they would confiscate and cite, and you'd have to go to court and pay fines because you transported off the reservation. And that became quite an issue. And this one night, we decided to cheat the wardens, to fool them. And we had two cars, and we filled up two gunny sacks, and we snuck up, crawled up, and stuck the bag of fish, snuck it into the car and down the road in the back, and then up in the front, where we knew we were being watched, made a big to-do of opening the trunk loudly and commenting about oh man, these are good ones. Wow, these are amazing. Oh, they're going to be so proud of us. And what we were really talking about was the rocks and the driftwood that we stuck in those two gunny sacks. Now, how nice they were. And we put the two gunny sacks in the trunk, and man, they're going to love this. Oh my gosh, these are the best ones I've seen. Slammed the trunk closed and got it in the car and drove down the road. Got to the stop sign, and the lights came on. They were following us as their lights off. And no more than pulled out on the road, and they had us stopped. All right, get out of the car. And got out, and let's have a look in your trunk. And I could have said, do you have a search warrant? But I didn't. And meanwhile, the car with the fish came up and pulled out and went by us laughing, went up the road back to the reservation. And there we were with driftwood and rocks in a gunny sack in the back of the trunk. And the game wardens really thought they had us for sure. Two of them were standing there with their flashlights. All right, get this open. I said, I have trouble with it. My key doesn't work very good. Let me see that. They opened that up, and they had the old tires stuck on top of those gunny sacks. Here they are right here. And they pulled that tire off, and they tagged those two gunny sacks out and start pulling out the driftwood and the rocks. And so that was one time we fooled them, and oh my gosh, we would tell that story over and over and over. But that's what they would do, is wait for hunters and fishermen to drive off the reservation and then cite them and arrest them and stop them, because we weren't allowed to do that before the treaty case, and our winning those cases in court, that we were, in fact, we did preserve those rights to hunt and fish in the ceded territory, and we had the right to transport game, in the ceded territory. Those were important findings in that court case. I was arrested one night. I didn't have my driver's license with me. I had come from swimming from some friend's house and coming through the boulevard up there, and uh, came through the lights and then into the dark. And before I could react, there's a deer standing in front. And the time it took my eyes to adjust and see the deer, I hit it and knocked it over. And it was just a little one. And I was right in front of the constable's house. He was a older, retired, and he came out and he was so mad, yelling at me, I killed his deer. You come in the house right now. And he went in and he had these old rotary, not not rotary, party line phones. He picked up and he said, "This is emergency. I gotta have a line here." And whoever was on had to get off. So he called in to the dispatcher, and the dispatcher says, "Well, the sheriff is out at the Turk's Inn having dinner." He says, "All right, I'll call out there." And so he called out to the Turk's Inn, and I could hear the sheriff on the phone in the speaker because I was listening, yelling. And the constable says, "I got a goddamn Indian here that killed a deer right in front of my house." And I could hear the sheriff say, "Haul his ass to jail." All right. And he hung up and he said, "Let's go." And I thought, I'm going to see how far they take this. I'm going to let him do it. So I got into his Jeep. We went into the jail. I walked through the door, and the jailer saw it was me. And he says, "Paul, what are you doing? What have you done?" He says, "The sheriff told me to bring him to jail." No, 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 no. And the jailer called Turks in to the sheriff. And within about 3 minutes, it's only just north of town, the sheriff was there apologizing to me and yelling at Paul, "You told me to do this." And the sheriff was yelling at him, "You can't do this." He hit a deer with his car, and here you're arresting him. My God, you got. "I'm so sorry, Ernie." He said, "Gee whiz." I'm standing there, and I says, "Well, Sheriff, the only thing I have to say is there's this thing called the Moxon Telegraph, and I have no control over it. And I'm sure this story is already halfway around the reservation, and the election is coming up, and you're coming up for election." "Oh, Ernie, oh, no, no, you can't. You got to tell the people this was a mistake." And he didn't get reelected. But that's what it was like back in the old days. You just, everyone had the assumption that you're a no good Indian and you belong in jail. And Indians would get arrested and taken to jail for hunting deer, in which by treaty they were really able to do, but the state was imposing these laws against us, and they enforced them. So those were the kinds of attitudes that people had. I have another story. I was driving to Flambeau with my mentor, Beneshi, Bill Baker, and it was in the evening, and we were going over for a powwow. The evening powwow was at the bowl, and we were coming through Oxbow, and just past on the east side of Oxbow, you go down close to the river. And just as we came around that corner, just crossed the Sawyer County line, we were just down by the river. There stood a deer over on the bank on the river side of the road. The old man, "Be call, be call, be call." Oh man, I pulled over and I came to a stop, and I'm looking out my window at that deer standing over there in the afternoon, evening sun, and thinking, "Oh, please, please, Beneshi, don't tell me to shoot him." He reaches in the back and he pulls the gun out from behind the seat, and he hands me the gun carefully. Oh, and there was no cars. And I'm thinking, oh, please, car, come along, chase the deer away. Please don't make me do this. And I put the gun out real slow and I'm listening for cars, no cars coming. And I aimed real slow and I wasn't going to shoot. All of a sudden, all I can hear was, shoot. Oh, so I shot and I thought, oh, he'll fall up there on that side of the hill and tumble down. Nope. He fell this way and tumbled down the bank right into the ditch right there alongside the road. And sure enough, here comes the truck. The truck goes by and there we were sitting on the side and there's a dead deer. And no kidding, within, I would say less than 10 minutes, there's a warden truck pulled up. And I had gone over and was going to try to drag it up over and gut it out. And we got caught, of course. And the old man started arguing with him, with the warden. This is, again, before the treaty case. And the old man's arguing with him. I have a right to take that deer. We're having a ceremony. We're going to it right now. I have a right to take that. And they're arguing back and forth, and the warden is telling us we can't do this, and he's going to have to confiscate the deer and the gun and cite us. And the old man is arguing as an Indian person, I have a right to take that. He said, we've always had that right. And the warden finally said, on whose authority? And old Beneshi went like this, on a higher authority than yours, my boy. And the warden looked at him and just lost his train of thought. He lost all the fire in him. And he didn't know what to say. And he looked over at me. He went back to his truck and he came back with a tag. And he gave it to me and he says, put this tag on that deer. I went over and put the tag on the deer. He says, now you get that in your truck and you get it out of here and you don't say a word about this. I didn't. We took the deer and we drove to Flambeau with it. That was, to me, something that old man, he didn't study law. He didn't study the treaties, but he knew it was there. It was something that we always had and we always retained. And he believed in it. And he believed that if we're doing it in a very sacred, spiritual way, that we had a right to do it. And so from that moment, I have always says to our young hunters and our fishermen, don't forget your asema. Asema ke. Make your offering with that tobacco. Asema ke. Speak good words. Don't forget the life of that animal or that fish. That fish spent its whole life in those nice clean waters that we have to keep those waters clean. And it eats some food over here. And then it swims through those waters and it takes that water through its body. And it goes over here and eats food over here. And then it swims over to here and it takes more of that clean water through its body. And from going from there to there to there, it's mixing those two foods, three foods together. Mixed with that clean, pure water that we see as sacred, that we should always take care of, never pollute. That's why we need clean water and clear water, so that those sacred fish can make those medicines. Maybe not for me, maybe not for my daughter, not for my nephew here, but probably for you. And if you live your life in a good way, and just so then that moment will come that that fish lived its whole life and made medicines just for you. And you'll be gifted with that fish, and you'll be able to take that inside of you and fulfill your given identity, your name, as Germaine intended for you. And that's that how sacred that act of gathering and hunting and fishing is for us, and why it's important to do those ceremonies when you go out there hunting and fishing and gathering, whether it's plants, medicines, birch bark, wood for your fire. Do it every time and preserve those old ways and those old stories. They're old stories for me. They're young. But when you're hearing them, they're old. And I heard old stories from the old timers when I was young. And so one day you'll be my age and your stories will be the old stories. And make good ones and make them carefully and preserve those old time traditions so that when you give them to the young ones, like the old ones gave to me, there's a power and strength in them, and you'll understand why the old rites, way back before the treaties were ever written, the way our connection and this way that we come to an agreement with all living things, that animal lives its life and gives it to you so that you'll be healthy. And so live your life in a good way so that when that medicine comes, it's going to work for you. Don't let things get in the way and prevent that medicine from doing its good for you. And when you do that, our treaties are going to be preserved and forever be the rule of the law that we hang on to. Those old timers went through a lot to make sure that we won that. And there are young fishermen that are still going out, that are still going through it. Just this past spring, Greg Johnson from our reservation in Flambeau was shot at by Chmokman standing up on the bank. And there were fishermen in the boat and elders and veterans in that boat. And they were shot at by a racist individual standing up on the bank. And when it was reported and when they went there, that fool was, of course, he was scraby, he was drunk. And when it went to the sheriff said from Vilas County said, oh, he was shooting at a squirrel. He wasn't shooting out there at the fishermen. And so that ignorance and that racism is condoned and excuses made for. and because they resent the fact that we have these rights, that we're not deserving of them for some reason. They really don't understand why we do have them, why they are so important to us. But the important thing for us is to always do them to a semake, do them in a spiritual way. So I'm going to stop there and kind of ask if some of you have some questions, maybe.
The first question was, were the tribal judges a result of the treaties?
Were the tribal judges a result of the treaties? There were tribal courts that go way back, and there were cases. In fact, one of my great uncles argued the first case over in Vilas County, and of course lost the case to the state, but that goes way, way back. And the current courts were first established because of the Indian Child Welfare Act and what was happening. A lot of you are very familiar with people that grew up in foster homes and shipped out. And I have 10 younger brothers and sisters who grew up in foster homes. And the stories they tell about it are horror stories. And some of them are good, but so to prevent that, to prevent our young people from being taken away like they were taken to boarding school closed, and so what they did is take them away and put them in foster homes, remove them from the families, and make white men out of them. A lot of those people that grew up in those foster homes have no idea of their own identity. They have lost a lot of it and lost the language, and that was the purpose of it. So the Indian Child Welfare Act then was enacted to protect our children, and the tribal courts were first established then to hold those cases in the tribe first. Along came the treaty rights, and that was quickly added as we wrote laws in our tribe to address those issues, hunting and fishing and gathering rights.
So if private land or falls on ceded territory, are we allowed to hunt there still?
If you owned, like I own 3 acres on our house, which is private land, and a deer walks onto that,
I think what they're asking is,
I do not have the right to shoot that deer.
so it's not legal to hunt on private land even if it's on ceded territory?
Correct. You cannot hunt on private land. Has to be public.
And they want to know if fishing is included in that. Like
And
if you're casting off a dock.
no, the water is state water.
How can it even be private land if it is within ceded territory? Was it private before 1854 treaty rights? Just trying to understand this.
Any land that is considered private land, you cannot exercise your usufructuary rights. Hunting and fishing rights, you can't do it on private land. Even if you yourself own that land, you cannot hunt and fish out of season. During the season you can, during the hunting and fishing season, the state season, then you can do it, but you cannot do it during off-season hunting and fishing. Anyone else have any other questions? Have a couple minutes left.
Does that only relate to hunting?
hunting, fishing, gathering.
But on the, oh, so off season on the res, you can hunt like anytime?
Anytime, yes. But traditionally, we observe the seasons of the animals. I remember when I was young, I was told when the fawns have spots, you do not hunt the deer. That's just the way I was brought up. Don't hunt any deer. All the fawns have spots. Okay, miigwech everyone for tuning in and listening today. Miigwech to the college and to my daughter and my nephew here, Stephanie and Odawa. I sure appreciate the invitation. I enjoyed this today. So, miigwech, gigawabamen.
There's a survey in the chat box too, so please make sure to fill out the survey and the registration that was put in there at the beginning of the presentation. We would appreciate your feedback. Miigwech.
Miigwech, Gigawababen, Minawa.